Welcome everybody to our annual book fair. We're honored to be the first synagogue in the line of book fair events. Thank you all for being here, and thank you for those of you that are tuning in on Zoom. We are honored to have Rebecca Clarren, who has written extensively and studied extensively on the West, the relationship between American Jews and the Lakota. The Lakota, Native Americans, the Native American indigenous tribe. I never liked the word Indian. I never did. I mean, this is in India, right? But Rebecca's going to talk about the book that she's written, So the Cost of Free Land. Anytime you're ready. Welcome. You're not Rebecca.
Can you hear me okay? Okay. Well, thank you all for coming here. Good afternoon to everyone. This is our 25th annual book festival sponsored by the Jewish Federation of the San Gabriel and Pomona Valleys. I'm Andrea Tarr. I'm the co-chair for this event with my co-chair, Linda Mazer. And before we begin, a few things to tell you. I want you to be aware of the exit signs on the right and left in case of an emergency.
Andrew, will you step over?
We can't hear
the
you.
mic, please.
Okay, how about now?
Can you step over slightly?
You're gonna want to trip. Okay, how's now?
Better.
Good? Better? Okay. To get started, I just wanted to say it takes a tremendous effort. Takes a tremendous effort and commitment to create this festival. So before we begin our program, I'd like to acknowledge a few folks this morning. First of all, a very big warm thank you to Rabbi Epstein. Thank you very much. And to Temple Shalom. And to Temple Shalom, the sisterhood. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Your assistance and cooperation in planning this bagel brunch was wonderful. Thank you to our dedicated committee members. I think we have a few somewhere. No? Okay. Our advanced readers, the Federation staff and our coordinator, Rebecca Russell, the Jewish Book Council of New York, from which we choose our authors, our literary circle members, whose financial support make this festival possible. And today we have Janine Mann, our board member, with us. Thank you for coming today. And of course, a very big thank you to Jake Tavel, who is our behind-the-scenes tech wizard. As our Jewish Book Festival celebrates its 25th year, this is indeed a milestone. And also, we have the Jewish Federation celebrating 30 years, another milestone. And this is 30 years of bringing our community together with programs like our Jewish Book Festival, PJ Library, Cultural Arts Program, and more, while serving as the Jewish voice for our community. Now, to mark this achievement, we have planned some very special 30th anniversary programs throughout the year, including our 30th anniversary celebration brunch on Sunday, June 23rd, where we'll be honoring our past presidents, saluting our first 30 years and looking toward our next 30 years. This afternoon's program will be a presentation by a very special author, our guest, Rebecca Clarren, we will follow this with a question and answer period. Now, if you haven't already silenced your phones, let me remind you to do that. And let's save our questions till afterwards at the question and answer period, which follows the author's presentation. And if you wish to purchase this book or any other books for this book festival, just go inside our social hall and you'll have the opportunity to purchase them following this presentation. And Rebecca will be happy to sign a book for you. Okay, let me introduce the co-host, Linda Mazer.
Thank you, Andrea. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our author, Rebecca Clarren. Rebecca has been reporting on the people and the landscapes of the American West, including the environment and the Native communities, for more than 20 years, and she brings nuance and understanding into our fixed ideas about the region. She has received numerous grants from the Fund for Investigative Journalism. She has won an Alicia Patterson Fellowship and the Hillman Prize. Now, among other things, the Hillman Prize recognizes courage in reporting and the impact of the coverage. Her work has appeared in such magazines as The Nation, Mother Jones, Indian Country Today, High Country News, and she's been interviewed by Terry Gross on NPR's Fresh Air. Her novel Kickdown was shortlisted for the 2018 PEN Bellwether Prize for Socially Engaged Fiction. And now, her second book has just come out this month, The Cost of Free Land, 3 weeks ago. So thank you, Rebecca. Thank you. We look forward to hearing all about your book.
Thank you, everyone. It's so nice to be here. And thank you for that warm welcome, everyone. To those of you on Zoom, I hope that you can see and hear me well. Before we get started, I want to take a moment to acknowledge that many of us here today might be feeling really intense grief or fear or sadness about what's happening in the world. And I think for me, I'll say that it is a moment where it's easy to feel a little lonesome in those feelings on social media in particular. And I am really glad we're here gathering together. And I hope today we can find a place of connection. For me, I think in light of the suffering that is happening in the Middle East, it feels more important than ever to explore histories of oppression, such as this very specific and unique history I tell in this book, The Cost of Free Land. My book takes this very complicated collective American history, and it tells it in a very personal lens through family stories, my own family stories. And a friend of mine who did a small review of the book, she said, this book proves that our personal histories are inextricable from our collective ones. It took me a long time, as you all kindly pointed out. I've been covering the American West for more than 20 years. I've gotten quite old, and I have, and yet I never knew. It took me a very long time, what feels sort of embarrassingly long, to understand that I was not an unbiased bystander and reporter to the legacy and the contemporary issues of United States policy as it impacted Native Americans. That in fact, my family had benefited greatly, and that I myself had as well. And so I just want to start with that to say that this book tracks somewhat of my personal journey of going from really not understanding at all my own relationship to understanding. And so we're going to begin at the very beginning of the book, where 23 years ago, this story and my own journey of understanding my proximity to this history begins. Thank you again for being here. 22 years ago, while on a reporting trip to the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, I found myself sitting shotgun in a truck with a man who would later become president of the Oglala Sioux tribe. He was smoking weed. When he offered me some, I declined, hoping to indicate a level of professionalism that as a reporter visiting an indigenous community for the first time, I certainly couldn't claim. We had driven off a dirt road and were parked at the top of a rise. Before us were green rolling hills and the flat plains beyond. A herd of buffalo with their dark brown backs dotted the landscape. It is likely that I was wearing jeans and a plain gray t-shirt. Back then, this was more or less my uniform for reporting trips, as I believed that by wearing clothes with limited personality, I could signal to sources that my identity didn't matter. In my bag beside me were a camera, a DAT recorder, and my slim reporter's notebook with the binding at the top. I had one great question prepared, which I had learned from a This American Life comic book about how to be a reporter. My boss had told me to write down every single thing that I saw and heard and smelled. But nonetheless, I failed to record whether the man beside me in the truck smoked a pipe or rolled a joint, or if he seemed very high, or how I felt about any of it. Sitting there in the small cab, I was uncomfortable with the quiet. I had yet to learn how to follow a source's lead. I had yet to learn so many things. In my nervousness, I decided to share something about myself. I told him that my family used to own land in South Dakota, that we had a ranch somewhere known as Jew Flats. I told him I had an uncle who everyone called Bronco Lou, who could stand on the back of a horse. I remember thinking that this might make him see we had something in common, that this might endear me to him. He was polite, maybe stoned, and he nodded. His smile was thin in a way I couldn't read. It would take me years to realize what my words would immediately signal to any Lakota citizen. The 9/11 attacks had taken place the week before I visited Pine Ridge. One evening while I was there, over a paper plate of food that the family I was reporting on was shared with me at a family gathering, I said something about the horror of the recent events in New York. Sitting beside me, a former American Indian movement activist stared at me, her mouth a flat line. She said, "Now you know what it feels like to be attacked and invaded. It's about time for Americans to understand how this feels." The day before, an Oglala elder had told me, "When I saw those people running through the streets with terror, I was reminded of my ancestors running in fear at Wounded Knee." Even then, I failed to connect certain dots, certain historic realities between her, the Lakota, and myself. All these years later, what stays with me from that reporting trip, what seems now to be the clear central narrative, appeared at the time to be only tangential to the article I was there to write. At the time, in 2001, I knew only the major plot points of my family's history in South Dakota. I knew that my great-great-grandparents had 6 children, 3 girls, 3 boys, and that they came to America as part of a wave of Jews who fled Russia and its anti-Semitism at the turn of the 20th century. I knew that they, like many other immigrants at the time, received free land from the federal government, a cool 160 acres that was theirs to keep, if they could turn the wild prairie into farmland. I knew their life was hard and strange. The stories that relatives had told me, well worn from years of retelling, underscored an unfailing tenacity, a specific toughness, as if it were a part of our DNA. One such story is like this. It's cold, it's winter in South Dakota. My great-great-grandmother, Fega Etka sent her 2 youngest daughters, who were as young as 10 and 12 years old, outside, armed with an axe or a log, to crack the ice-choked eddy of the creek behind the house. Once they succeeded, Vega Atka went to the creek, stripped, and dumped herself in the frozen water. This was her mikvah. That my great aunt and several cousins refer to this story as cute, as in, do you want to hear a cute story? Tells you something about the women in my family. Another selection from our greatest hits. When one of the 6 Sinekin children was old enough to look a little bit old, they would write 21 on a piece of paper and stick it inside their shoe. Then they would walk into the land office and ask to file a homestead claim on their very own 160-acre parcel. The land clerk would look them in the eye and ask if they were of age, and they would swear without lying, "Yes, sir, I'm over 21. But my family handed down these particular stories, selected from the slush pile of history, leaving other more problematic plot lines behind, is instructive. Because, of course, both the stories we tell and our decision not to tell others create the myth we pass to future generations. Of all the stories I was taught, there was no handed down story about the Lakota and my relatives. We never talked about our family's neighbors on the very nearby reservations. I have spent, as we've noted already, almost my entire life, adult life, reporting on the American West, attempting to write articles that expand our fixed ideas about the region, highlight inequities, and tell the stories of people and places often overlooked. Yet when it has come to my own ancestors' history on the South Dakota prairie, I maintained a blind spot. Only after years of reporting in Indigenous communities did it dawn on me that my family, that I myself, had benefited from centuries of federal mistreatment of Indigenous peoples in the United States. It would take many other reporting trips to other reservations in the years after I first went to Pine Ridge for me to deepen my suspicion that my family's singular focus on specific moments disconnected us from those who didn't share our genetics. Our stories of the prairie clearly imparted the values of toughness, religious commitment. They failed to convey nuance and complexity. I would begin to suspect that in fact our history and that of the Lakota intertwined like a double helix, invisible and yet shaping everything. So this book is what I call an entangled history of Jewish immigrants, Jewish Americans, Jewish homesteaders, and Native people. It is not meant to be a complete history of the Lakota Nation or a complete history of Jewish immigrants, but it is the connective tissue between those two. It tries to show how do these histories push and pull on one another. I was taught to believe that history is something we're walking away from. It's behind us. And yet the more time I spent with Jewish leaders and with Native elders, the more I have now come to feel that the history, I write this in the book, that the history is no longer behind us. It is like looped to the contemporary moment like thread through a seam. History does not live in the box. It's still here right now. And so because of that, I wrote this book. It's a history that is not only about the past, it also is written in the contemporary moment. And it toggles back and forth also between the past and people living today in America, in Native and in Jewish communities who help us understand the ripples of that history through time. Again, I think I started my career at a magazine called High Country News, which writes about the American West. And my old boss there used to say, this is a thinly disguised policy rag. And really, I feel like every story I've written since leaving there is trying to take complicated, seemingly very boring federal legislation and policies and bureaucratic efforts and show how those play out in the lives of individuals and families. And so because of that stance, I suppose, or perspective, chapter 1 of my book does not begin in South Dakota, but in Russia, where my family was living, like probably many of your families, in the Pale of Settlement. So I'm going to read to you a little bit from the beginning of that chapter. To understand how a Jewish community ended up settling on Lakota land, we must begin in Odessa in the spring of 1881, when my great-great-grandfather, Harry Sinekin, was around 19 years old. It was unseasonably hot. In fields outside the city, crops were wilting. An economic downturn had left thousands of factory workers unemployed. People were hungry. A dry wind blew incessantly, raising dust and dirt that fell from the sky like ash. Months earlier, terrorists had assassinated the Russian Tsar Alexander II. Rumors boiled in the streets and the countryside, blaming Jews. Though unfounded, the accusations flourished. Jews had long been reviled as different, as Christ killers. In early May, as out-of-work men spilled from taverns, they formed a mob, stormed the streets, looking for Jews. Some later reported hearing the chants from blocks away, "The Jews drink our blood." Harry Sinekin, drawing on the survival instincts that would serve him well on the South Dakota prairie 2 decades later, dove under his bed as soon as he heard the angry rioters. If he was armed at all, it was at best with a kitchen knife, as it was illegal for Jews to own guns. Others would later recall having only rocks and slabs of wood with which to defend themselves. Harry heard men yelling. He heard the windows shattering. He heard the door crash to the ground. The mob smashed every mirror in the house. They broke all the furniture, and then Harry felt the heavy wooden bed frame crash onto his face. His nose broke, blood was everywhere. The peasants or the soldiers, whoever they were, they found him, they beat him. They broke every one of his ribs, set fire to the house, and left him for dead. The looting of Jewish shops and homes and the attacks on Jewish people continued in Odessa for 6 days. Such violence towards Jews was so common, so systemic in Eastern Europe, it had a name, pogrom, which comes from a Russian word that means both to destroy and to conquer. Somehow, Harry survived and escaped the beating house. For the rest of his life, he would suffer from the effects of the beating and smoke inhalation. His children would describe his behavior as erratic. Even so, he was lucky to be alive. This is an immigrant story, like all immigrant stories of survival, of leaving the known world to flee to a new place. It begins with fear and relies on luck. My family stories about Harry have always followed a classic script. We highlight his pluck and how he overcame adversity on the road to opportunity. We fail to acknowledge the reverberations of our family's good fortune, or the fact that it came at the expense of others. I'm going to share some pictures that are in this book, and so if I could have my first slide, please. I wanted to show you, so Harry, recovering from that pogrom, nothing is known what happened to his father and his uncle. He had been living in Odessa with them, but his mother, his parents had gotten divorced, actually. It's very unique for the time. He goes home to Kapulia, which is a shtetl near Minsk in the Slutsk region, if anyone knows that region, and it's what's today Belarus. And this is a photograph of my great-grandmother's 2 oldest siblings standing outside house where they lived. The Yiddish I've had translated, it's written at the top, you can kind of see it in the white snow on the roof, and it says the Hinterish house. And so probably this was the back house of where they lived. Life in Kapulia, like it was for Jews throughout the Pale, was complicated. Jews were not, for the very most part, allowed to own land. They were restricted from certain kinds of jobs. My Harry, who you've now met, he was a tinsmith, but Jews couldn't join, they couldn't work with fancy metals. They couldn't work with gold, they couldn't work with silver, but they could work with tin, the lesser metals. And so he had a bunch of people who worked with him, and they made the tops of the synagogues and the churches in Kapulia. Kapulia was not only Jewish, there were also a little bit of the Russian Tartars that lived there and Christians, Russian Orthodox. So they leave because life is so difficult there. Harry and his younger brother leave with thousands and thousands of other Russian Jews, and they come to America. And my family ends up in Sioux City, Iowa, which is at the end of a rail line, and it is the place where tons of other Jews from the same exact region have come. And they're in the meatpacking business, and they're peddlers, and they get each other jobs. And it's such a uniform Jewish community. I read some amazing histories that were written by the Jewish Federations of Iowa about the time and the history there. They almost all spoke with the exact same Yiddish accent. It was so unified. There was even a synagogue in Sioux City at the time called Anshe Kapulia, named for this shtetl. So they learn at some point, we don't know exactly how Harry learns, that there is free land on offer in nearby South Dakota. But there were signs, there were big signs that would be in the newspapers or in the railroad stations advertising that the US was giving away free land, 160 acres, yours to keep if you could prove up, which meant that you would put a building on the house and you would farm it, turn this wild land into something civilized. And my great-great-grandfather Harry gets one of these newly on offer homesteads. And the reason why this free land was on offer probably did not occur to my family. They may not have known. Other histories I've read of Jewish, there's one called Lakota Diaspora, a self-published history of her family being Jewish homesteaders, and her family was told they thought it was empty. They thought there was nothing there. In fact, this was a very intentional United States effort because the relatively new state of California and its raft of natural resources, the railroads, which were at the time the biggest corporations and most powerful corporations in America, and like today, corporations had a lot of power in politics in DC, the railroads wanted to build a rail line connecting all these wonderful oranges and other offerings here, California, to the rest of the country. But there were several problems. One, they realized it was that just the expense of shipping from California to the East Coast would not support the expense of that, and what they needed was lots of little communities along the rail line that would help support the cost, that their need to get their goods and services between places would support traffic and building the rail line. The other problem was that in 1851, the United States had signed treaties with Plains nations, including the Lakota, promising to leave the land of western South Dakota for the Lakota, that it would be theirs forever. And so promises made became promises broken. And there's a map at the beginning of the book, and you can see the way that the United States changed its mind again and again and again. And between 1851, when that first treaty was signed, by the early 1900s, that's not a lot of time, the Lakota, let's not use the passive tense, the United States take or steal, because both happen, 98% of the land that it had set aside for the Lakota in 1851. As you may know, the Lakota were buffalo hunters. That was their main way of survival. And their spirituality and religion is deeply embedded in being buffalo people. And their origin stories talk about the buffalo teaching them how to be humans. But the buffalo were a big impediment to building a rail line. Slide, please. This is buffalo skulls. And you can tell that that's probably 2 stories high. That's a photo from 1892. So at the same time that there's this effort to open up all this land for settlers, the United States has an incredible intentional effort to exterminate the millions of buffalo that are on the prairie. And by the 1890s, there's 300, 500 buffalo left in the country, in all of in North America, I believe, actually. And so without the buffalo, the United States is pushing the Lakota onto these slivers of reservations in western South Dakota, where they're no longer going to rely on the buffalo, which would mean they would be moving around a lot, which would be a problem for railroads and maybe problematic for the white people that are moving there, and instead they will be farmers. Now, the United States works to diminish Native Americans from rebelling against these policies in many ways, and one thing that to me was one of the most startling things I learned in my research was that the Nazis, that Hitler, was inspired for how to treat the Jews in Germany by the way America treated Native Americans here. There's a whole book written by an incredible law professor, James Whitman, called Hitler's American Model. He's out of Yale, and it's really incredible book. But there was this moment early on when I first started working on this book, and a Lakota elder who I came to know, who we'll learn about soon here, he called me. It was the day after Holocaust Remembrance Day. He said, last night I was listening to the news and some Holocaust survivors, and I immediately thought of your family. He said, America is right to condemn Hitler, of course. Why doesn't it condemn itself? We had a Holocaust here in America for 400 years. No one ever talks about it. And I was a kid who was obsessed with the Holocaust. Like, I read every book I could get my hands on. I now have a child like that, and it's totally unnerving, to be honest. But I thought I knew so much about World War II. And it was only when Doug Whitehold, this elder, told me that I then went and did tons of my own research and learned that was true. And I talk about this in the book, but there's a handful of very specific things that Hitler was inspired by. One, the way the United States kept Native people starving. They didn't give them enough food, and they could no longer hunt the buffalo. And part of those treaties said, well, you can't hunt the buffalo anymore, but we will give you rations, we'll give you food, but they didn't give them enough food. So they were starving. And think about the starvation in concentration camps and how debilitating it is. And in the book Cast by Isabel Wilkerson, she makes this point. And Lebensraum, Hitler's idea, like we're going to expand our Aryan nation to make space, living space for all of our Aryan brethren into Slavic countries, that came from Manifest Destiny. Even Nazi legal code looked to America and the way America had limited the rights of Black and Native citizens for how to limit the rights of Jews in Germany. There's a famous, I guess it's sort of famous in Hitler circles, historian circles, that he commended Americans for keeping those Native, I mean, he used a less nice word, Native Americans in cages, which were the reservations, which I guess was a model for his concentration camps. So it's an incredible history that I really never knew. And I don't know if my family understood. You know, the dividing line in Europe was, are you Jewish or are you non-Jewish? And they come to America, and the dividing line is color. And whiteness here is graded on a curve, and they look white enough. There's still incredible anti-Semitism that they're experiencing, but they look white enough to get that land. So getting back to the story of my family, it's a little unclear exactly when they get out to the prairie, but I did research at the National Archives, and certainly by 1908, they plant their first crop on the South Dakota prairie on what had very recently been Lakota land. Slide, please. So this is a photo of my ancestors on the South Dakota prairie. I love how white their outfits are. How did they keep everything so white? On the far right is Fega Etka, my great-great-grandmother who took her mikvah in some freezing cold creek near there. You can see behind, I hope, that there's a sod barn. At the time, by this point it was a barn, although initially they lived in that sod house. And sod, if you don't know, sod houses were houses made out of the cut bank of the hill. They were made of dirt. Can you only imagine how dirty those places would have been, and dark? Fairly quickly, they worked very hard to build houses. Slide, please. That is their claim, what were called claim shacks. They are unimaginably small. If you can see the man with the incredible high boots to the second from the right, that's my great-grandfather, Jake, who was a homesteader. And the third from the left is my great-uncle Ted. And the photographer who took it said, "Company on the claim." I've learned, so it wasn't just my family that were homesteaders. They went with about 30 families from Sioux City all together to, if you've ever been to Wall Drug, this place was about 25 miles northeast-ish of Wall. And they were in sort of non-contiguous homesteads to get all these Jews. And as I was doing my research, I learned that, and visiting the land, I learned that people today still call this place Jew Flats, even though no Jew has lived there for a very long time. There was one person I met who was maybe more my age, and he said, "Oh, it never occurred to me there were actually Jews who lived here. We just always have called it Jew Flats." Their lives there were hard, as you can imagine. There's a famous story of one of my cousins, distant cousins, one of my great-grandmother's nephews, clearing a path every morning to the outhouse from his claim shack of rattlesnakes when he was 5 years old. But at the same time, and there was incredible drought, they learned very quickly that farming, where there's no dams, there's no irrigation, this was a very tough place. It's part of why the United States initially had decided they would leave it for the Native Americans, because they didn't think the land was worth anything. And most Lakota had not been farmers. They always had gardens near rivers, but they followed the buffalo because they knew, what my family learned quite quickly, that this was a very difficult place to be farmers. There were stories I learned of people saying, one year our best crop was Russian thistle. So it was difficult, and they become ranchers instead of farmers, which worked out better. But the land was incredibly important to them. So, in two ways. The first was psychologically. My great-grandmother and her sister Rose called this place the Good Earth, and to their dying day. It meant so much to them, coming from a place where they couldn't own land, to be landowners. And it made them feel American. They were working so hard to assimilate as quickly as they could. And there's recent research by sociologists and historians who have shown that even for those homesteaders who were immigrants who didn't prove up, who lost the land, their time on the prairie was very instructive. It allowed people to shake off their suspect immigrant status. They looked more like everyone else. They had things in common. And so it really helped them metabolize their immigrant experience. The other thing it did, it's had a huge economic impact, not basically based on their crops or the ranching, although I think they did okay. As an investigative journalist, it was important to me to pair the stories that I had heard with data. So I actually did a lot of research in the deeds office. I pulled every single deed on the land that my family owned, and then I pulled every single mortgage that was there in those deeds, on those deeds. And what you start to see, because my family throws nothing away, and I'm the same way, I have an attic full of boxes. We don't throw away nightgowns. Like, there's tax returns from 1911. There were receipts of my family giving money to Jewish organizations in 1922. It's amazing. I found telegrams Rebecca had sent to people in Kapulia. But, and thousands of pages of letters and journals. And what you start to find, what I found when you pair those mortgages and the dates of those mortgages with the contents of the letters, is that over and over again, my family would take that little bit of money and they would use it to start a new business. They would use it to move and start over in a new place. Keep their land, let the neighbors take care of it. Maybe they travel back twice a year, but they'd start over. And economists that I consulted talked about how it's very important, actually, to not consider what's the land worth. It wasn't just sort of the amount that we sold it for, because we sold the last bit of that land in 1970, my grandmother and her sisters did. But it's those little pieces of land along the way that make such a big difference. So, sorry, just let me get there are today in America as much as 25% of the adults in America descend from homesteaders. Oh my God, I only have 5 more minutes? Okay. Oh, I have so much more to say. And there's research out of Brandeis that shows that if you have a home, a second home, can send your kids to college, and you're descended from homesteaders, that intergenerational wealth of getting that land is probably very important. It's very important that we just go on and show you the next slide, please. I grew up, despite having many stories, I had a lot of stories. There were no stories about our Native American neighbors, but there were photographs of my ancestors posing with Native people. Slide, please. And this next slide, that's my great Uncle Jack, and he's standing with a man who I learned in my research was Joseph Whitepole, who was the nephew of Sitting Bull and very important Lakota chief. And I came to know his oldest living descendant, Doug Whitepole, who is a veteran teacher and beloved coach and an elder. He's 80 years old now. And it was through knowing him and his family that I was started to kind of what I think of as like filling in the white spaces at the edges of the family stories that I learned. I was going to read a little bit from a part about Doug, and yet I think I do want to save time for questions for all of you, so maybe we'll forgo that. But another very important thing I want to talk about before we go to questions is that before this was even a book, I was working on a series of stories, and I was able about Native Americans that ran in the nation and Indian country today, and I got the privilege to write a profile of Judge Abby Abenanti, who is Chief Justice of the Yurok Nation. She was the first Native American to be a lawyer in California. She's an incredible model of how you run a courtroom with incredible empathy, and she's becoming a model for judges all over the country of how you do justice through a traditional and cultural context. She said to me, if you're thinking of doing this book, you have to study the Jews. What do the Jews say? That's your culture. What do the Jews say about how to respond to a harm, even one you didn't directly commit, but one you benefited from? She said to me, this question I kept having, how much did my family know? She said everyone knew what was happening to Indians. But also classically, Judge Abby, she was very quick to have incredible empathy for my ancestors. She said, but when you're running for your life, you're not stopping to have a quick restorative justice conversation along the way, She said you have to be growing up. That's why this has come to you. It takes several generations to live without trauma. And you were lucky enough that you didn't have to live with that trauma that your family experienced in Europe. And so it's appropriate that you're the one to grapple. And to be Jewish is to grapple, right? So my rabbi and I spent a couple of years doing Havruta together. And Rabbi Benjamin Barnett, he's my rabbi in Portland, Oregon. And that Havruta is traditional Jewish paired study, and we looked at places in the Torah and the Talmud where they talk about atonement and repentance and how to repair. And we read contemporary Jewish rabbis who are talking today about how to use those teachings in response to what one of them called the original sins of America, the enslaving of people and the taking of native land. And there's two stories that I'd love to share. I'm going to try and share at least one. Linda's giving me the go-ahead. Well, one that I think is very interesting that you may all know about Sharon Brous at ECAR in LA. And she wrote a sermon in 2017 for Rosh Hashanah in which she talked about how, she says, our country was built on a stolen beam. And that comes from a story in the Talmud in which there's a discussion between two rabbis where they say, what happens if it's discovered that a palace or a house or even a palace was built with a stolen beam in its foundation? And one rabbi says, well, you have to tear the whole thing down and return the beam. The other rabbi, the far more pragmatic, says, no, you just have to return the value of that beam. But when both of them make it very clear, whoever is living at the house at the time has to take responsibility. You must do something. To not do anything, Brous and others have said, diminishes the respect and integrity of the people that live in that house. There's another teaching by Toba Spitzer that I've thought about a lot, and it's also in the book. Toba Spitzer is a rabbi on the East Coast. This teaching comes from Deuteronomy, and it's what happens if it's discovered that there's a murdered person in the middle of the road, and no one can figure out who the murderer was. This was in pre-Israelite times. And the two communities that lived closest to the murdered victim would measure their distance. And whoever was closest to the murdered victim would take responsibility, not just for burying it, but for doing somewhat of a costly ritual. It involved killing a heifer, bloody things, but that had an economic cost to that community. And Toba Spitzer says this tells us that sin is collective and must be dealt with collectively, because to avoid it pollutes the entire community. There's Margaret Jacobs is an incredible historian. Her book, After 100 Winters, is it was out recently with Princeton. She also looks at the entangled histories of settlers and Native people. And she says, if you are non-Indigenous and living in America, you are benefiting from America's taking of Native land. And I like to think, because it forms the foundation of our highway systems. Many of our universities were founded with cheap or free land. There are many examples. And I think, for me, I think about my distance is closer because my family were homesteaders and I've benefited from that than maybe someone who arrived in America last week, someone whose family arrived on slave ships. But I do think we all benefit. I also think it's important to say, I don't feel guilty about this. I feel a real sense of injustice. And I hope you don't feel guilty if you've never thought about this before or grappled with it before, because we were not taught this in our schools. I had an excellent education. and I never learned this history. Even after reporting in Indigenous communities for years, I never really understood the depth of this history until the last 5 years of working on this book. If you do have interest in trying to find yourself in this story, in the back of this book there are resources that are for your further research. They're not definitive, but they're things that helped me when I was starting out trying to find my own proximity to this. And thank you so much for listening and being here, and I'm glad to answer any of your questions. Although I think Linda's going to start off with one. Thank you so much.
Sure, I think that would be great. Okay, so, one of the questions I had, okay, let me ask, let me start with the audience first.
Use closer to the microphone.
Okay, I have a lot of questions, but I want to start with an audience question. Does anyone have a question first?
Will you mention the Q&A feature on Zoom,
Oh,
please? Sorry,
Okay.
I don't think it's been mentioned.
okay. Oh, I forgot everything. First of all, I want to thank Rebecca for her informative, heart-rending description of the Native Americans and how we have benefited all from our going to the universities to the railroad and its subsequent hot national highways. There's just no doubt that we are the recipients of their harm and losses. And that's what inspired me to recommend this book, because, and the fact that she learned so much about the Jewish tradition of atonement and repentance and repayment, and we are all the beneficiaries. And I found that very, as a way to get, I'm interested in how I can give back for harming someone else. But anyway, now we look forward to your questions. And for those of you in the room, raise your hand and we'll see if I don't need to repeat the question. And for those of you on Zoom, please type your questions in the Q&A.
In the chat?
Oh, not
The Q&A. Okay, so Rabbi, I saw your hand up.
Yeah, being a baby boomer, growing up in the 60s, we've certainly seen, I don't know what the right word would be, evolution in the way Native Americans are portrayed. Back in the early days in the 50s, when Westerns were very popular, Native Americans were very often the enemy, unless you were the Lone Ranger. Recently, we have sort of a modern Western series that's very, very popular, and you all know I'm talking about the show Yellowstone. And there's been some discussion about the way Native Americans are portrayed on that show. Some people say it's very positive, other people say it's complete fiction. What are your comments?
So
repeat the question.
the question was about the show Yellowstone, which there's some debate on whether it's a good and accurate portrayal of Native people. I have to say, I don't know. I've never watched the show. And I would recommend that people look to, there's an incredible organization called Illuminative that is a Native-led organization that's doing incredible work in getting Native voices into popular culture. There's an incredible show called Reservation Dogs that I love, it's been created and produced and acted in and written by an entirely Native American team, and it's, to me, one of the best things on television. So I think that's a great question. I wish I could answer it, but I kind of intentionally have to say I think I've stayed away from watching it in part because of some of the Native Americans that I know having mixed feelings about it. So that might speak to that.
That actually answers the question.
Yeah. Yes.
In the last 5 years, 10 years, there have been more Native Americans in Congress and in the cabinet, in Joe Biden's cabinet, the Minister of the Interior is.
Deb Haaland, yeah.
Yeah, and so can you speak to the trajectory if that's helping at all?
Please repeat.
So the question was that there is more representation than there used to be in Congress, in Joe Biden's cabinet of Native people. There's Deb Howland is in charge of the Department of Interior. There's also a native person from the Northwest in charge of the National Park Service. And is that helping? And I would say, Judge Abby always says to me, we picked the wrong superpower, we're invisible. So I think there's a long way to go. And I think, yes, there is more representation, but the reality is the United States has really failed to apologize ever. The one sort of apology was made under the Obama administration, and it was tagged on to a Department of Defense Appropriations Act, and it was announced before no media, no Native people were there, and it's not great. Like there's an incredible book of poetry called Whereas that Layli Long Soldier, an Oglala Lakota poet, wrote that's a reaction to the lack of apology. And so I would say we remain in a federal vacuum. I mean, you compare us to Canada, Australia, countries that have also very upsetting histories of their treatment of their indigenous peoples, and their efforts to respond have not been perfect. They're deserving of criticism, but they at least exist. And so yes, it's probably better, but we have a long way to go from where it was, and we still have a way to go, I would say.
And again, in Australia and Germany, see how they have responded with the reparations, and
Right.
the apology.
Well, right, so Australia is further down the road, and if you want to read more about this, I would again recommend reading After 100 Winters, because she really gets into the details about this, about how Australia has not, and in Canada, there have been truth and reconciliation efforts, there have been reparations. I mean, Germany is held up, as we know, as a very imperfect response to the way they hurt the Jews in the Holocaust. They do give money to Holocaust survivors.
I was going to say thank you for mentioning Caste, because I think it's such a fascinating book, and
The best.
we read it in our local book
Oh, good.
library. But do you think there's more awareness of the treatment of African American slaves than what's happened with Native Americans to some extent? I mean, maybe that's a hard thing to answer, but I sort of think there's been more literature and more, even more novels and more kind of discussion of slavery and the impact on African Americans, perhaps compared with the Native Americans.
Please repeat.
The question is there more sort of information available to us in America about the treatment of Black Americans and the treatment of Native people? And I don't know, I have not a comparative study of that, so I really shouldn't, as I say, get out over my skis around it, but I would say there is probably more discussion about reparations for Black Americans happening today than there is for Native people, and there's a lot of reason behind that of why, but yeah, yes.
How has your family responded to the book about your ancestors? How's your family responded to this information?
I'm so glad you asked. So the question is, how did my family respond to me writing about our family in this different way? I was trying to say, here's the stories you guys have always said, and here's this other piece. And I would say that it's been overwhelming to me how, for the most part, my family has been incredibly proud. And I might get a little pumped because it's been very scary to me. I knew I wanted to write this book, and I knew I wanted to write in this way, but I come from a big family and I love them, and I worried that they might not want me in the family anymore. And that didn't stop me from writing this, but what I did is I did things a little differently than I had. As a reporter, you're usually taught, like, never show what you're writing until it's after it's published to the people it's about. And I just didn't want to do that. I wanted to be more transparent. So a year ago, when I had a more final draft, I actually went to Minnesota, where my great aunt Etta, who's the matriarch of our family, she's 90 years old, she's all over this book. You'll come to know her and love her, I hope, in the book. I brought her the book and also my young, adorable child, sort of will sweeten the deal. She was very upset because not about the idea of the book or about the thrust of it at all, actually. It was because I talk about my family's history of becoming bootleggers in this book. And my family gets into bootlegging, And there's a really, I don't know what that sound is, but if anyone could help fix that, stop that, that'd be great. There's a really interesting history of why Jews in particular get into bootlegging during Prohibition. And it's partly, can you guys still hear me? Okay. It's partly because the Prohibition was driven in large part by an anti-immigrant thrust, and to say, there's all these immigrants working in the liquor business. If we take their jobs away, they'll leave. Well, my family was not going to leave and go back to Russia, and they knew American progress moves in one direction, and it's totally tied to wealth, and so they got into the bootlegging business. And I love that chapter in the book. It's fascinating to me. My family becomes incredibly wealthy for a while. It was a shanda in my family. One of my ancestors goes to jail, and we didn't talk about it in certain, like I always knew growing up, but my cousin, who I'm very close to now, she never knew this history at all. And so that's been really hard for my aunt. But I think as our generation, my generation has said, my cousins have been so dear to me, and they've said, we're so lucky that that our family story gets to be a part of something that is so important, and that means so much to me. And my Aunt Etta and I just feel like if you lean toward love, if you keep leaning in toward love, hopefully that saves the day. And it certainly has. Like, we've had many conversations, it's been difficult, and yet to see she can hold two things in her mind at once. She can hold that this part's embarrassing for her, and that she's so proud of me, and she loves me so much. And she wrote to me right before Yom Kippur, and she had read the book, and she said, thank you for helping me be more of a realist at the age of 90. And that makes me feel like there's hope for the rest of us if she can do that, So.
Okay, we'll take one from Zoom and then we have to cut it off because this is too much to say, too little time. Okay, here we have, I applaud your sharing of both the harsh reality of the Lakota people and your personal family history in the US and its intertwining of experiences. My comment, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
My comment is a hope that facts such as the ones you've shared, and like those in the book, such as The Killers of the Flower Moon,
By David Graham,
would become part of our American educational system and combat the myth of the American West.
I hope so too.
So with that,
Thank you so
unfortunately,
much.
we have to close our conversation.
I'll be signing books. Everyone come meet me at the signing table.
Yes, and I want to also tell you how happy we are to have you in person.
Thank you.
Okay, and so here is the book. You'll see it in the other room, and it's for purchase here, and she'll sign them. And if you're on Zoom, the book is available at all in-person book events, and buy it wherever you buy your books if you don't come back. Join us next Sunday, October 29th, when Omer Bartov will be discussing his book, The Butterfly and the Axe, at 4 p.m. at the other Temple Ami Shalom, and also on Zoom. And then the following Wednesday, November 1st, in the evening, Oren Kessler will be discussing his very timely book, Palestine 1936, The Great Revolt and the Roots of the Middle East Conflict. So, and it's only on Zoom, and it's not too late to register. So that is very timely. And then we also have our one book, one community selection. Get started reading now, A.J. Sidransky's Incident at San Miguel, which is it's a true story about two brothers in Cuba in 1958, one Castro, one not, and what follows after that. Temple Sinai, November 19th, 4 p.m., and of course on Zoom. And thank you again for joining us and for supporting the Jewish Book Festival. We look forward to seeing you next time.